A letter smelling of tobacco and hope lured Grace O'Malley 2,000 miles west, but the promise of a new beginning was a lie. When she stepped off the stagecoach in Montana seeking survival, the man who bought her ticket met her with a closed fist rather than an embrace. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a slave. Broken and left to die in the freezing muck of Main Street while the town watched in silence, Grace saw a shadow fall over her. It belonged to a man known as a beast, a mountain man with ice in his veins, who offered no pity, but 3 words that would change history: "Come with me." The stagecoach door groaned open, spilling the stagnant air of a 3-day journey out into the biting wind of Purgatory Springs. Grace O'Malley stepped down, her boots immediately sinking 2 inches into the thick, freezing slush that passed for a street in this god-forsaken mining town. She clutched her carpetbag so tight her knuckles were white, the leather biting into her skin. She was 24 years old. But in that moment, under the grey, oppressive sky of the frontier, she felt 100. Back in Boston, she had been a seamstress, invisible and starving. Here she was a mail-order bride, a commodity. "You, O'Malley?" The voice grated like gravel shaken in a tin can. Grace looked up. Standing on the boardwalk, sheltered from the sleet by the overhang of the Nugget Saloon, was a man who looked less like a groom and more like a predator. Jebediah Crouch was a heavy-set man, his belly straining against a grease-stained vest. He had eyes like wet stones and a beard that hid a weak chin but couldn't hide the cruel set of his mouth. He held a crumpled photograph in one hand, her photograph. "I am Grace," she said, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts to sound brave. "Mr. Crouch?" Crouch didn't smile. He stepped off the boardwalk, ignoring the mud that splashed his trousers, and circled her. It wasn't a welcoming gesture. It was an inspection. He looked at her the way a butcher looks at a side of beef, checking for gristle. "You looked sturdier in the picture," Crouch spat, disappointment dripping from his tone. "Boston photographer must have used soft lighting. You look scrawny. Can you pull a plow? Can you gut a deer?" Grace stiffened. "I can cook, Mr. Crouch. I can sew, and I can keep a home. I am willing to learn the rest." "Learn?" Crouch laughed, a harsh barking sound that drew the attention of the loungers on the saloon porch. "I ain't looking for a student girl. I paid $50 for your passage. $50 for a mule that can't pull." "I am not a mule," Grace said, a spark of Irish fire flashing in her green eyes. "I am your wife-to-be, as per our contract." "Contract?" Crouch sneered. He stepped closer, invading her space, smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed skin. "Let me show you what I think of contracts." Before Grace could flinch, his hand lashed out. It wasn't a closed fist, but the back of his hand was heavy and hard. It connected with her cheekbone with a sickening crack. Grace didn't scream. The shock stole her breath. She spun, her feet slipping in the treacherous mud, and she went down hard. The cold slime coated her dress, soaking through the thin fabric instantly. Her carpetbag flew from her hand, landing open, spilling her meager possessions, a Bible, a hairbrush, and a spare woolen shawl, into the filth. The silence that fell over the street was absolute. Grace gasped, tasting blood and dirt. She pushed herself up on shaking arms, looking around. There were men on the porch, a woman watching from the window of the general store. The sheriff, a man named Red Miller, who was known to take bribes from Crouch, leaned against a post, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. No one moved. "Get up," Crouch hissed. Grace tried. She got to her knees. Crouch kicked her in the ribs. The pain was blinding, a white-hot lance through her side. She collapsed again, curling into a ball to protect herself. "I said $50, Crouch shouted to the town, playing to his audience. "And they send me a broken twig. I don't want her. Any of you boys want a broken Boston doll? She's free to a good home or the hogs." He turned back to her, leaning down, his face inches from hers. "You stay here, you starve. You try to come to my ranch, I'll feed you to the wolves myself. You hear me?" Grace couldn't speak. She could only wheeze, the mud freezing against her cheek. Crouch spat on her, turned on his heel, and walked back into the saloon. The doors swung shut. The piano started playing again. The town of Purgatory Springs went back to its business, leaving a woman beaten and discarded in the middle of the street like trash. The rain began to fall harder, turning from sleet to a freezing downpour. Grace lay there, shivering violently. She knew, with a terrifying clarity, that if she closed her eyes now, she would never open them again. This was how she died. Not in a warm bed, but here, thousands of miles from home, unloved and unnamed. Then the ground vibrated. It wasn't a horse. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of massive boots. The silence on the porch returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't indifferent. It was fearful. Grace forced one eye open. Through the rain and her swollen eyelid, she saw boots. Bearskin boots, tied with leather thongs, crusted with pine needles and dried earth. She looked up, past legs like tree trunks, past a coat made from a buffalo hide, up to a face that looked like it had been carved from the granite of the Rockies. He was huge, at least 6'4", with shoulders that blocked out the grey sky. A beard the colour of iron filings covered his jaw, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple down through his eyebrow, disappearing into the facial hair. He didn't look at the saloon. He didn't look at the sheriff. He looked down at her. His eyes were blue, shockingly, piercingly blue. He crouched down, ignoring the mud soaking his knees. "You broken, girl?" His voice was deep, a low rumble that she felt in her chest more than she heard. It didn't sound cruel. It just sounded old. Grace tried to whisper, "Help!" The giant reached out. His hand was the size of a shovel blade, calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he brushed a lock of wet hair from her face. "He hurt you bad," the man stated. It wasn't a question. He stood up then, towering over her. He turned his head towards the saloon. "Sheriff!" the mountain man rumbled. Sheriff Miller straightened up, looking nervous. "Now, Silas, don't go starting trouble. It's a domestic dispute. Crouch paid for her." "He threw her away," Silas said. "One man's trash is another man's treasure. Isn't that the law of the salvage, Miller?" "Silas, she's city folk. She won't last a night up at your place," Miller stammered. Silas looked back down at Grace. He saw the bruise blooming on her cheek. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the way her hand was gripping the mud, trying to push herself up. She was fighting. "She won't last an hour down here," Silas said. He bent down and scooped her up. It was effortless. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour, cradling her against the rough wool and fur of his chest. She smelled pine resin, wood smoke, and something musky, the scent of the wild. "My bag," Grace wheezed, pointing a trembling finger at the mud. Silas paused. He looked at the ruined Bible and the brush. He crouched, hooked the bag with one finger and stood back up. "Hold on," he said to her. "Where?" Grace mumbled, her head swimming as the darkness encroached. "Where are we going?" Silas began to walk, his stride eating up the distance to where a massive black stallion waited, tied not to the hitching post, but standing free. "Away from here," Silas said. "Come with me." And as the darkness finally took her, Grace O'Malley felt safer in the arms of the beast than she ever had in the civilized world. Consciousness returned to Grace in fragments, the rhythm of a horse walking, the biting wind on her face, a warmth radiating from behind her. She jolted awake with a gasp, instinctual panic seizing her throat. "Easy." The voice was right at her ear. She was sitting astride a horse, wrapped in a heavy blanket, her back pressed against the solid wall of the mountain man's chest. His arms were around her, holding the reins, effectively caging her in, but keeping her from falling. "Don't struggle," Silas said, his voice flat. "We're on the switchbacks. You wiggle. We both tumble 2,000 feet. My horse, Goliath, is sure-footed, but he don't like surprises." Grace froze, her eyes widening as she looked down. To her left was a sheer drop-off into a canyon that was already swallowed by twilight shadows. To her right, a wall of rock. They were climbing higher than she had ever been in her life. The air was thin and sharp, smelling of snow. "Who are you?" she whispered, her teeth chattering. "Silas Hawthorne," he said. "Folks in town call me Bear. You can call me Silas." "Where are you taking me, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Home," he said simply, "unless you want me to turn around and drop you back off at the Nugget for Crouch to finish the job." Grace shuddered. The memory of the blow, the mud, the humiliation washed over her. "No, please, no." "Then sit still. We're almost to the timberline." They rode in silence for another hour. Grace's ribs throbbed in time with the horse's gait. She was exhausted, hungry, and terrified. She had heard stories of mountain men, savages who lived like animals, who took women and kept them as chattel. Was she trading one monster for another? But he had picked up her bag. He had wrapped her in a blanket, and he hadn't touched her, not in that way. He held her with a detached, protective firmness. They crested a ridge, and the terrain leveled out into a high alpine valley, a bowl of white snow and dark pines, sheltered by jagged peaks. In the center of the clearing, smoke curled from a stone chimney. A cabin, built of massive logs, squatted against the tree line. It looked like a fortress. Silas halted the horse and slid off the back with surprising grace for a man of his size. He reached up. "Slide down. I've got you." Grace tried to swing her leg over, but her ribs screamed in protest. She cried out, freezing in place. "Right, the kick," Silas muttered. He reached up, grasping her waist. His hands spanned her entire torso. He lifted her down, setting her boots gently on the packed snow. Her knees buckled. He caught her again. "You're worse off than I thought. Crouch has a heavy foot." He swept her up into his arms again and kicked open the heavy oak door of the cabin. The inside was a shock. Grace expected a dirt floor and squalor. Instead, she was met with warmth. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, a roaring fire casting a golden glow over the room. There were furs on the floor, bear, wolf, elk, but the floor itself was planked wood, swept clean. There were shelves lined with books, tin jars, and tools. A heavy wooden table sat in the center. It was masculine, yes, but it was a home. Silas carried her to a cot in the corner, covered in a thick quilt. He laid her down. "I need to see the damage," he said, turning to a basin of water and cracking the ice on top of it. He threw a log on the fire and came back with a wet cloth and a small jar of salve. Grace clutched the collar of her ruined dress. "No." Silas stopped. He looked at her, his blue eyes unreadable in the firelight. He pulled a wooden stool over and sat down, the joints creaking under his weight. "Listen to me, girl. I've been pulling arrows out of myself and stitching up cougar bites since before you were born. I ain't looking at you as a woman right now. I'm looking at a wounded animal that needs tending. You got broken ribs, likely. Maybe internal bleeding. If I don't bind them, you'll get pneumonia and die. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have left you in the street." Grace looked at him. The scar on his face was jagged and white against his tanned skin. It looked like a map of pain. He was a man who knew what it was like to be hurt. Slowly her hands relaxed. I can do the dress." She unbuttoned the top, exposing the bruising that was already turning her side a sickly purple and black. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't leer. He frowned, his jaw tightening. "He cracked 2 of them," he said clinically, gently pressing his fingers against her side. Grace hissed in pain. "Sorry, I have to wrap it tight. It's going to hurt like hell, but it'll help you breathe." He worked efficiently. He tore strips of clean linen. He applied a pungent, cooling salve that smelled of wintergreen and arnica to the bruise, then wrapped her torso tightly. "What is that?" she asked, the pain subsiding slightly to a dull throb. "Mountain medicine. My mother taught me. She was Shoshone." "Oh." Grace looked around the cabin again. "You live here alone?" "I do." "Why did you help me?" Silas stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He walked to the fireplace and picked up a coffee pot, pouring a steaming black liquid into a tin cup. He brought it to her. "Drink, it's Arbuckle's, strong enough to float a horseshoe." He sat back down, staring into the fire. "I was in town for supplies, flour, salt, ammunition. I saw what he did." He paused, his voice dropping. "I saw the town watch. That's the sin, Grace. A man like Crouch. He's a rabid dog. You expect a rabid dog to bite? But the folks watching, the ones who did nothing, that's the rot." He looked at her. "I couldn't leave you there, not with winter coming in tonight. Winter? It's October. Up here." Silas gestured to the roof. "Winter doesn't look at the calendar. The pass will be snowed in by morning. You're stuck here, Grace." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "Stuck? For how long?" Silas took a sip of his own coffee. "Till the thaw. April, maybe May." Grace stared at him. She was trapped in a cabin, on top of a mountain, with a strange giant of a man, for 6 months. "You're safe here," Silas said, sensing her panic. "I sleep in the loft. You take the cot. I won't touch you. You have my word, the word of Silas Hawthorne." "And if Crouch comes looking?" Silas let out a short, dry chuckle. He stood up and walked to the wall where a heavy Winchester 1873 rifle hung on a peg alongside a massive Bowie knife. "Let him come," Silas said, his voice hardening into stone. "The mountain eats men like Jebediah Crouch, and if the mountain doesn't—" He touched the handle of the knife. "I will." Outside, the wind howled, and the snow began to pile up against the door, sealing them in. The world had disappeared. In its place was a white void. For 6 weeks the snow had fallen, relentless, heavy, and silent. It buried the cabin up to the windowsills, turning the interior into a twilight cave, illuminated only by the hearth and the kerosene lamp. For Grace, the first month was a blur of pain and healing. Silas was a man of his word. He treated her with the distant, efficient care of a doctor. He changed her bandages, brewed willow bark tea for the pain, and cooked stews that were thick with venison and root vegetables. But he barely spoke. He moved around the small space like a caged predator, his size making the cabin feel smaller. By mid-November, Grace's ribs had knit enough that she could breathe without wincing. The bruises faded to yellow, then vanished. But the fear took longer to fade. Every time Silas dropped a piece of firewood or sharpened his knife, Grace flinched. One morning, Silas was gone. He had left before dawn to check his trap lines. Grace stood by the frosted window, watching the empty white expanse. The isolation was suffocating. She needed to be useful. She refused to be a burden. She looked around the cabin. It was clean but disorganized. It was a bachelor's den. Slowly, painfully, she began to work. She found a sack of flour and a tin of lard. She had no yeast, but she knew how to make unleavened biscuits. She stoked the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she wielded the heavy iron skillet. She found a needle and thread in his supplies, thick thread meant for leather, but she unraveled it to make it finer. She took his torn spare shirt from a peg and sat by the fire, mending the rip in the shoulder. When the door finally creaked open hours later, a gust of freezing air and snow swirled in. Silas stomped his boots, carrying 2 brace of rabbits. He stopped dead. The cabin smelled different. It didn't smell like stale smoke and wet dog anymore. It smelled of baked bread. He looked at the table. There were biscuits, golden and steaming. He looked at the peg. His shirt was mended, the stitches small and precise, far better than his own clumsy repairs. Grace stood by the fire, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked terrified, as if she expected him to strike her for touching his things. I made supper," she whispered. Silas hung up his coat. He walked to the table and picked up a biscuit. He was a man who ate for fuel, not for pleasure. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. It was soft, warm. It tasted like a memory of a life he had buried long ago. "It's good," he grunted. Grace let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "And the shirt," he added, glancing at the peg. "You didn't have to." "I can't hunt, Silas. I can't chop wood yet. Let me do what I can, please. I need to earn my keep." Silas looked at her. The swelling was gone from her face. She was beautiful, in a haunted, fragile way. Her red hair, usually tied back severely, was loose around her shoulders. "You aren't a servant, Grace. You're a guest." "I'm a survivor," she corrected him, her voice gaining a surprising steel, and survivors pull their weight. The dynamic shifted that night. They ate together at the table, not in silence, but in a quiet companionship. "Show me the gun," she said suddenly. Silas looked up from his plate. "What?" "The Winchester. If a wolf comes when you're gone, or if he comes, I need to know how to use it." Silas wiped his mouth. He considered it. Most men in town would laugh at the idea of a woman handling a lever-action rifle. But Silas wasn't most men. He stood up, took the rifle from the wall, and checked the chamber. "It's heavy," he warned. "Kick like a mule if you don't hold it tight to your shoulder." He walked over to her. "Stand up." He handed her the weapon. It was heavy, pulling her arms down, but she gritted her teeth and lifted it. "Elbow up," Silas instructed. He stepped behind her to adjust her stance. For the first time since the rescue, he was close. Truly close. His chest brushed her back. His large hands covered hers on the stock and the barrel. The heat radiating from him was overwhelming. Grace's breath hitched, not from pain, but from a sudden electric awareness of him as a man. Silas froze. He could smell her, lavender soap, his soap, and woman. He looked down at the top of her head. He had been alone for 5 years. The proximity was torture. He abruptly pulled away, his voice rougher than usual. "Keep the stock tight. Squeeze, don't pull. We'll practice outside tomorrow." He retreated to the loft early that night. Grace lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl, her skin still tingling where his hands had been. The cabin was a shelter, but it was starting to feel like something else, a crucible where 2 damaged souls were being forged into something new. The storm that hit on Christmas Eve was a widowmaker. The wind shrieked like a banshee, shaking the sturdy logs of the cabin. The temperature dropped so low the nails in the walls popped with loud cracks, sounding like gunshots. They couldn't sleep. The cold was a physical weight, pressing in from all sides. Silas had built the fire up until it roared, but the draft still snaked along the floor. Grace sat wrapped in a buffalo robe on the rug near the hearth. Silas sat in his chair, whittling a piece of pine, the shavings curling onto the floor. "It's Christmas Eve," Grace said softly. Silas didn't look up. "Just another night up here." "Do you have family, Silas?" "Down there?" She gestured vaguely towards the valley floor, buried miles beneath them. "No. No one. The mountain is my family. The wind is my kin." "That's poetry, not truth," Grace challenged gently. She was growing bolder. "You weren't always a mountain man. You speak too well. You read those books." She pointed to the shelf containing Shakespeare, Emerson, and a worn Bible. Silas stopped whittling. He looked at the knife in his hand. The firelight danced on the jagged scar running down his face. "I had a wife," he said. The words fell into the room like heavy stones. "Mary, and a daughter. Little Beth." Grace's heart ached at the tone of his voice. It was dead, hollow. "What happened?" "Cholera, 1869. Silas looked into the flames. "We were living in St. Louis. I was a carpenter. A good one." "But the city? It's a cesspool." "The sickness took them both in 3 days. I couldn't save them. I held them while they burned up with fever, and I couldn't do a damn thing." He looked at Grace, his eyes wet but fierce. "I came west to get away from people, from the filth, from the noise. I wanted a place where the air was clean. I built this cabin to be a hermitage, a place to die alone." "But you didn't die," Grace said. "No, I survived. That's the curse." He touched his scar. "Got this from a grizzly 3 winters back. He mauled me good, left me for dead. I sewed it up myself. I realized then God wasn't going to let me off that easy. I had to keep living." He turned the gaze on her. "What about you, Grace? Why does a girl with hands soft as yours sell herself to a man like Jebediah Crouch?" Grace pulled the robe tighter. The truth was ugly, but in the face of his confession, she couldn't lie. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "My father was a drunk. He died owing money to the wrong people in Boston, a man named O'Shea. He ran the textile mill where I worked." She shuddered, the memory colder than the storm outside. "O'Shea said I could work off the debt. But he didn't mean at a loom. He meant in his bed." Silas's hand tightened on the knife handle until his knuckles turned white. "I ran," Grace continued, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I saw the advertisement for a bride in Montana. It said, 'God-fearing rancher looking for a partner.' It sounded like salvation. I spent every penny I had on the ticket. I thought anything was better than being O'Shea's whore." She looked up at Silas, her eyes burning with shame and anger. "I didn't know I was running from one devil just to meet another. When Crouch looked at me, it was O'Shea's eyes all over again." Silas moved then. He slid out of the chair and onto the rug beside her. He didn't touch her, but he put himself between her and the dark corners of the room. "You ain't trash, Grace," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're iron. You ran 2,000 miles to save your soul. That takes more courage than most men have." Grace looked at him, the scary mountain man, the beast. He was the most honorable man she had ever met. "You saved me," she whispered. "Why?" "Because when I saw you in that mud," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion, "I saw Mary. I saw what would have happened to her if I wasn't there to protect her. I couldn't save my wife. but by God, I could save you. The distance between them vanished. It wasn't physical desire. Not yet. It was a profound spiritual recognition. They were two people broken by the world, hiding at the top of it to lick their wounds. "Merry Christmas, Silas," she whispered. Silas reached out, his rough hand covering hers. "Merry Christmas, Grace." "Nan." The wind howled outside, burying the world in white. But inside the cabin, the ice around Silas Hawthorne's heart finally began to crack. But peace is a fragile thing in the Wild West. While they bonded in the sanctuary of the storm, down in Purgatory Springs, the snow was melting. And Jebediah Crouch hadn't forgotten the $50 he was owed. He was sitting in the Nugget Saloon, drinking whiskey and listening to a tracker named One-Eye Pete tell him exactly where the mountain man's cabin was. "Wait for the thaw," Crouch told the men gathered around his table. "Then we go up. I want my property back, and I want Hawthorne's head on a spike." The sun had returned. It started as a trickle, the sound of water running under the snow, then became a roar as the creeks swelled with the melt. The white prison of winter broke apart, revealing patches of brown earth and stubborn green shoots. For Grace and Silas, the thaw was bittersweet. Winter had been their shield. The snow had kept the world out, allowing a fragile, tender love to bloom in the firelight. They hadn't spoken of it. Silas was not a man of words, and Grace was afraid to break the spell. But it was there in the way he brushed her hair in the evenings, in the way she mended his clothes with painstaking care. "The pass is open," Silas said one morning, standing in the doorway, looking down at the valley. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. Grace was kneading dough at the table. She froze. "What does that mean?" "It means I need to go down. We're out of salt, coffee, powder." He turned to her. "And we need to settle this. You can't hide forever, Grace." "I'm not hiding," she said, wiping her hands and walking to him. She placed a hand on his chest, over the thick wool of his shirt. "I'm living. For the first time." Silas covered her hand with his. His eyes were intense. "I won't let him take you, but we need the law on our side. I know a judge in Fort Smith. Judge Parker. He's a hanging judge, but he's fair. If we can get a message to his deputy—" Crack. The sound was sharp, flat, and instant. Silas jerked back, a spray of red mist erupting from his left shoulder. "Silas!" Grace screamed. He stumbled back into the cabin, tackling her to the floor just as a second bullet shattered the doorframe where his head had been a second ago. "Get down!" he roared, kicking the heavy oak door shut with his boot and throwing the iron latch. "You're shot!" Grace gasped, seeing the blood soaking his shirt. "Through and through! Missed the bone!" Silas gritted out, his face pale. He crawled towards the window, grabbing the Winchester. He peered through a crack in the shutter. "6 of them," he reported, his voice devoid of fear, replaced by cold combat instinct. At the tree line, Crouch is there, and Sheriff Miller and 4 hired guns. "Miller?" Grace felt cold. "The law is with them?" "Miller isn't the law," Silas spat. "He's Crouch's lapdog." Outside, a voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "Hawthorne, send the girl out. You do that. Maybe we don't burn you out." It was Crouch. He sounded drunk on power. Silas looked at Grace. He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy Colt revolver. He pressed it into her hands. "Remember what I taught you?" Grace's hands shook, but she gripped the heavy steel. "Aim for the center. Squeeze!" "Good girl," Silas whispered. He kissed her forehead. A desperate, hard kiss. "We aren't surrendering. If they want you, they have to climb over a pile of hot brass to get you." The first hour was a chaos of noise and splintering wood. The hired guns unleashed a barrage of lead into the cabin. Bullets punched through the chinking, shattering jars and sending clouds of flour into the air. Silas was a demon. Despite his wound, he moved from window to window, his Winchester cracking with deadly precision. He dropped one man near the woodpile. He wounded another by the creek. Grace wasn't idle. She crouched on the floor, reloading the spare magazines, her fingers black with gunpowder. When a man tried to flank them, running toward the blind side of the cabin with a torch, Silas was too slow. "Left side!" Silas yelled. Grace scrambled up. She saw the shadow through the gap in the logs. The man was raising a burning, pitch-soaked rag. She didn't think. She raised the heavy Colt, leveled it through the loophole, and fired. The recoil jarred her shoulder, but the man screamed, dropping the torch and clutching his leg. "I got him," she cried, shocked. "Don't celebrate yet," Silas yelled. "They're rushing." The front door groaned under the impact of a battering ram, a small log carried by 2 men. "Back door," Silas commanded. "We have to run. The cabin is a trap now." "Run where?" "The ridge, high ground." Silas kicked open the back door, which faced the sheer rock wall of the mountain. There was a narrow goat path leading up. "Go, I'll cover you." "No, together." Grace grabbed his good arm. They burst out into the cold spring air. The gunfire intensified. Dirt kicked up around their boots. Silas spun, firing the Winchester from the hip, suppressing the men charging around the corner. They scrambled up the rocky path, lungs burning. They reached a plateau about 300 feet above the cabin, a place Silas called Dead Man's Drop. It was a cul-de-sac of stone with a sheer drop on 3 sides. They were trapped, but they had the high ground. Below them, the men swarmed the cabin. Crouch was screaming orders. "They're on the ridge, get them!" Silas collapsed behind a boulder, his face grey. The blood loss was catching up to him. "Grace," he wheezed. "Here." He handed her the rifle. I can't hold it steady." Grace took the rifle. She looked down the sight. She saw Crouch. He was wearing a fine duster coat, looking out of place in the wild. He was laughing. He thought he had won. "He's coming," Grace said, her voice turning icy. "Let him come." The wind at Dead Man's Drop didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore at Grace's skirt and whipped her hair across her face, blinding her for seconds at a time. But the cold wasn't what made her shiver. It was the sight of Silas. The mountain man was fading. He had slumped against the grey granite of the cliff face, his legs sprawled out in the dust. The blood from his shoulder had soaked through his heavy buffalo coat, turning the fur matted and slick. His face, usually the colour of tanned leather, was now the shade of old parchment. "Silas," Grace whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. She grabbed his hand. It was freezing. "Stay with me. You promised." Silas's eyelids fluttered. The blue eyes were hazy, fighting a losing battle against shock. "I ain't going nowhere," he rasped, though the words lacked his usual iron. He tried to shift the Winchester rifle in his grip, but his fingers fumbled. The weapon clattered against the stone. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. They were cornered. Behind them was a sheer drop of 500 feet into the churning white water of the Snake River. To the front, the only path up, a narrow choke point of jagged rock where Jebediah Crouch and his men would appear any second. "Take the gun," Silas wheezed, pushing the rifle toward her with a trembling hand. "There's 3 rounds left. Make 'em count." Grace took the heavy weapon. It felt cold and alien in her hands, a tool of death she never wanted to touch. Yet now, it was her only lifeline. She crawled to the edge of the boulder they were using for cover and peered down the path. She heard them before she saw them. The crunch of boots on loose shale, the heavy breathing of men unaccustomed to the altitude, and then the voice that had haunted her nightmares for 6 months. "Come out, little bird." Jebediah Crouch's voice echoed off the canyon walls, distorted and manic. "I know you're up there. There's nowhere left to run." Grace looked back at Silas. He was staring at a specific spot on the ground near his boot, a small, innocuous pile of loose rocks. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the haze cleared from his eyes. He gave her a microscopic nod, shifting his leg just an inch closer to the pile. The trap. Silas had built this failsafe years ago, not for men, but for rock slides. He had told her about it during the long winter nights. A single retaining pin, hidden under rubble, holding back tons of timber and scree above the path. But they had to be close, terrifyingly close. The first figure to emerge onto the plateau wasn't Crouch. It was Sheriff Miller, his face slick with sweat, his badge catching the harsh sunlight. He looked nervous, his revolver drawn but shaking. Behind him came the 2 remaining hired guns, looking battered from the siege. And finally, Jebediah Crouch. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a madman. His duster was torn, his hat was gone, and his face was twisted into a rictus of pure hate. He spotted them immediately. Silas slumped and bleeding, Grace kneeling with the rifle aimed at his chest. Crouch stopped, 20 paces away. He didn't fire. He smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Grace had ever seen. "Well, well," Crouch sneered, holstering his pistol with slow, arrogant deliberation. "Look at the mighty bear of the Rockies, bleeding out like a stuck pig." "Stay back," Grace screamed, the rifle shaking in her hands. "I'll kill you." Crouch laughed, stepping forward. "You? You're a seamstress, Grace. You ain't a killer. You sew buttons. You don't pull triggers." He took another step. The sheriff hesitated. "Jeb, let's just finish it. The man is dying." "Shut your mouth, Miller," Crouch snapped without looking back. "I paid for the girl. I'm taking the girl. And as for him," Crouch pointed a gloved finger at Silas. "I want to watch the light go out of his eyes." Grace's finger tightened on the trigger. She wanted to shoot. She needed to shoot. But Crouch was moving erratically, weaving slightly, and Sheriff Miller had his gun leveled at her. If she missed, they were dead. "Put it down, Grace," Crouch commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Put it down, and maybe I don't let the boys have their way with you before we head back to town." It was a bluff. She knew he would hurt her regardless, but she also knew Silas's plan. Lure them in. Slowly, with tears streaming down her face, Grace lowered the rifle. She let it drop to the dust. She raised her hands in surrender. "Please," she sobbed, forcing the weakness into her voice. "Please, just let him live. I'll go. I'll do whatever you say." Crouch's ego swelled. He puffed out his chest. The victor. "That's more like it." He signaled the men. "Miller, go check if the beast is dead. You two grab the girl." "Oh." The men surged forward. They crowded onto the narrow neck of the plateau. They were committed. Grace looked at Silas. Silas Hawthorne didn't look like a dying man anymore. He looked like Judgment Day. With a roar that sounded like it came from the bowels of the earth, Silas kicked the pile of rocks with his heavy boot. Click-thud. The sound was mechanical, heavy. A tension wire snapped. The world above them exploded. It wasn't snow. It was rock and timber. The retaining wall Silas had rigged years ago gave way. A massive log, weighing easily 1,000 pounds, swung down on a hidden pivot, followed by a landslide of shale and boulders. It didn't hit the men directly. That would have been too quick. It crashed down behind them, smashing into the narrow path they had just climbed, obliterating the exit. Dust billowed up in a choking grey cloud. The hired guns screamed as they scrambled back, only to find the path gone, replaced by a wall of debris. Crouch spun around, coughing, his eyes wide with sudden panic. "What did you do? What did you do?" "I closed the door," Silas gritted out, forcing himself to stand up. He swayed, using the cliff face for support, his hand pressing a rag to his bleeding shoulder. Crouch whipped his gun out, aiming it at Silas. "I'll kill you. I'll kill you both." "Drop it!" The voice didn't come from Silas. It came from the sky. Everyone froze. They looked up. Standing on a high outcropping of rock, 20 feet above the plateau, was a lone figure, silhouetted against the sun. He held a Winchester rifle steady as a rock. He wore a flat-brimmed hat and a long coat, and on his chest a silver star gleamed. It was Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, the most feared lawman in the territory. "Jebediah Crouch," Reeves's voice boomed, calm and authoritative, cutting through the wind. "You are under arrest for the robbery of the First National Bank of Denver and the murder of a federal teller. Drop your weapon, or you will meet your maker right here on this rock." The color drained from Crouch's face. The wealthy rancher facade crumbled. He wasn't a businessman. He was a thief on the run. That was why he needed a docile wife who wouldn't ask questions. That was why he paid off the local sheriff. Sheriff Miller dropped his gun as if it were red hot. "I didn't know," Miller wailed, raising his hands. "Marshal, I swear I thought it was a domestic dispute." "You're under arrest too, Miller," Reeves stated coldly. "Corruption is a federal offense when I say it is." But Crouch wasn't surrendering. He was a rat in a corner. He looked at the marshal, then at the blocked path, then at Grace. Madness took over. Crouch lunged. Before Silas could react in his weakened state, Crouch grabbed Grace by her hair, yanking her back against his chest. He jammed the barrel of his revolver into her temple. "Get back!" Crouch shrieked, saliva flying. "I'll blow her brains out! I swear it. I'll take her with me." Marshal Reeves held his fire. The angle was too steep. He couldn't take the shot without risking Grace. Silas took a step forward, blood dripping from his fingertips. "Let her go, Jeb." "Stay back, Bear!" Crouch dragged Grace towards the edge of the cliff, the drop into the river. "I'm leaving, and she's coming!" Grace felt the cold metal against her skin. She smelled the fear and stale whiskey on Crouch. She looked at Silas. He was too far away. He was too weak. She wasn't. Grace remembered the lessons in the snow. Survivors pull their weight. She didn't struggle away from Crouch. Instead, she stomped her heel down with every ounce of strength she possessed, driving it into the arch of Crouch's foot. He howled, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Grace didn't stop. She threw her head back, slamming her skull into his nose. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage. Crouch shrieked, blinded by pain, his gun hand wavering. "Now, Silas." Grace dropped to the ground, scrambling away. Silas didn't have a gun. He had something better. His hand flashed to his belt. The Bowie knife, 14 inches of forged steel, flew through the air. It turned end over end, a silver blur in the sunlight. It struck Jebediah Crouch high in the shoulder, burying itself to the hilt in the muscle of his gun arm. Crouch screamed, dropping the revolver. The force of the impact, combined with his own backward momentum, sent him staggering. He took one step back, then another. His boot heel found nothing but air. Crouch's eyes went wide. He flailed, his good hand grasping desperately at the empty sky. "Help me," he pleaded, staring directly at Grace. Grace stood up, panting, her hair wild, her face streaked with dust and tears. She looked at the man who had beaten her, sold her, and tried to kill the only person who had ever loved her. "Karma is hard, Jebediah," she whispered. He tipped backward. The scream was long and thin, echoing down the canyon walls until it was abruptly cut short by the roar of the Snake River far below. Silence returned to the mountain, heavy and absolute. Silas's legs finally gave out. He slid down the rock face, sitting heavily in the dirt. "Silas!" Grace scrambled over to him, ripping the hem of her petticoat to press against his wound. "Marshal, we need help!" Bus Reeves was already moving. He slid down a scree slope with practiced ease, landing on the plateau. He ignored the cowering Sheriff Miller and knelt beside Silas. "Easy, son," Reeves said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He examined the wound. "Through and through. Missed the artery. He's a tough old bear, this one." Silas looked up at the legendary lawman. "Took you long enough, Bass." Reeves chuckled, a deep rumble. "Had to wait for the snow to melt, Silas. Even I can't walk through 10 feet of drift. But I got your telegram from the trader. You said you had a situation." Reeves looked at Grace, then back at Silas. "I'd say situation is putting it lightly." Grace was weeping now, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. She buried her face in Silas's neck, not caring about the blood or the dirt. "You're safe," Silas whispered, stroking her hair with his good hand. "He's gone. It's over." Grace pulled back, looking into his face. "You said come with me. You saved me." Silas shook his head slightly. "No, Grace. You saved us." 1 year later, May 1876. The town of Purgatory Springs was different. Sheriff Miller was in a federal prison. The Nugget Saloon had been bought out and turned into a respectable dry goods store. But the biggest change was up on the mountain. The cabin didn't look like a fortress anymore. Flower boxes lined the windows, filled with mountain bluebells. A new barn stood to the east, housing Goliath and a new mare. On the porch, rocking in a chair he had built himself, sat Silas Hawthorne. His shoulder stiffened up when it rained, but he could still chop wood better than any man in the territory. The door opened, and Grace stepped out. She wasn't wearing the rags of a mail-order bride. She wore a dress of blue calico she had sewn herself. In her arms, wrapped in a soft quilt, was a baby boy with piercing blue eyes. She walked to Silas and handed him his son. "He's sleeping," she whispered. Silas looked down at the child. He looked at the scars on his hands, then at the perfect, unblemished skin of the baby. He looked up at Grace, the woman who had walked through hell to find him. "He looks like you," Silas said softly. "He has your stubbornness." Grace smiled, leaning down to kiss Silas. They looked out over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in purples and golds. It was a wild, hard land. But it wasn't lonely anymore. They had been dumped in the dirt, beaten by the world, and left for dead. But like the mountain wildflowers pushing through the snow, they had found a way to rise. And that, my friends, is the legend of Grace and Silas. It's a story that reminds us that mail-order bride is just a label, but the human spirit is unbreakable. Grace wasn't saved by a prince. She was saved by a beast. And in turn, she saved him right back. They proved that even in the lawless West, where men like Jebediah Crouch ruled with fear, justice, and hard karma, eventually comes calling. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the 3 words that started it all. Come with me. What did you think of Marshal Bass Reeves showing up? That was a real historical figure. If you loved that twist, please smash that like button and share this video with a friend who loves a good Western romance. Do you think Silas and Grace made the right choice staying on the mountain? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. Next week, we have a story about a mafia boss who falls for his rival's daughter. You don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.